why the figure had appeared to me in the mirror. This old ancient, I took it to be an ancient Celt, and was just looked like somebody who had been through a lot of wars and a lot of problems, and was worn down. The long matted hair and the burlap robe, and just mute. It looked like somebody who was carrying a tremendous burden. And in fact, I didn't know if it was an image of myself, of my internal self, as I was going through some real struggles at the time in terms of a divorce, and also trying to figure out what was going on in terms of my career as a poet, since I had veered off the common road of written poetry into the road of oral poetry, which is a kind of no-no. But I was drawn into it, and I have continued that route, by the way, that I think that it's the route for me to take. And although I continue to write poetry, in terms of the bulk of it is now spoken spontaneously, and I have many CDs out of it. I also have many video versions, which is simply another visual layer that is laid on top of the spoken musical poem, and those are called dream stories, and you can see those on YouTube, which the address is below. Let me say that at that stage, God knows that in fact I would have just been left in a state of confusion if Alice Hickey hadn't reappeared. And that I tracked her down. She had somehow contacted Diane Randall in a dream or something. Diane Randall had a dream and went out. The dream said, basically was a kind of fuzzy dream, she said, but there was one that was telling her to go out at the end of Fruitville Road, and she did, and she kind of followed her honing instinct and came to a house, and that's the picture of Alice's house there, with Alice was there by the mailbox, and Alice told Diane that she wanted to see me, and at that stage of the game, Diane got in touch with me, and she didn't tell Diane where she wanted to see me. She said more or less, he'll know, and I went back to the Winn-Dixie, and in the evening by the tomato bin, and there was Alice. And from that stage of the game on, we started to unravel what was happening and what the long mythic poem was all about, and what all of the voices and the one vision I had of the ancient figure were all about. I won't go into a lot of that, except to say that a lot of our meetings took place at Starbucks, which was probably the least place you would find Alice, who was so anti-establishment everything, but she liked the Java, she called it. She was Alice at the time was in her 70s. I was just turning 60, and she liked the New York Times. She would read the Times, and she would drink coffee all day and just Starbucks, and then she'd go back to her little farm and do whatever she did. But we had many meetings there, and then we started to travel, and one of the trips we took was down to Alamos, Mexico, where at the time Joan was living. She was really moving around, and she had a home there. It's an old mining town in the middle of nowhere, with some very old homes. It's one of the few towns in Mexico that's pretty much like it was hundreds of years ago, and it was a town set up solely to mine silver. So it's in the middle of nowhere, with grand homes, grand churches, and everything like that. But it has no life whatsoever, and it really died out in the 1900s when the silver ran out. It was as big as Comstock, and then it finally came back to life because some gringos came down from California and the West and started to restore the homes and become the new Dons, basically, So she had a home there. It wasn't in the Don section. It was in one of the more Mexican sections, which in fact she preferred. And both Alice and I went down there to visit her, to see if we could piece together what was going on. We got some information on that, and and then in fact, I went down. And in fact, that earlier before Alice had returned, I went with Pinga Dentista to see my aunt Mercedes Noriego, who was also a psychic and who had told me when I was a young boy, about 11, and my eyes were crossed, that when I was 12 they would become uncrossed. I was pretty impressed at the time because when I reached 12 my eyes uncrossed, so that I knew she had some ability, and I went down to see her. I hadn't seen her for 20 years, but it was one of those trips where it didn't work. For some reason she just didn't want to say anything about the psychic world. She was pretty much a society matron, and I don't think she really trusted me, to be frank about it. So, big mouth poet American, and nephew, but doesn't have his feet on the ground, so to speak. But we that was a particularly tough period because I was hoping she'd be able to help me break through, because I hadn't met Alice yet. For the second time, she hadn't come back into my life, and I was really at my wit's end trying to figure out why I couldn't understand a poem that came out of me. I'd always been able to do that before, as though it came from somebody else. And anyway, with Alice, we then just started to travel down, and in fact, on the one trip we took down to Mexico, we saw that Joan, who had been leading a rather peripatetic life, had kind of set herself up there with her gardener, Angel Tuxedo, and that translates in English as Angel Tuxedo, who she had talked into wearing the chauffeur's outfit. And Angel was a great guy, he was a great gardener, and there's a little picture of him there, but she had him kind of dressed up in a village people outfit, with the boots and the jodhpurs and the chauffeur's coat, which was an old tuxedo that she had put together for him, and he used to drive her around town. She was afraid of banditos, Joan. She thought she was living in the 1920s in Humphrey Bogart time. This town was very safe, but she wanted to be driven around by Angel, who was about 5'2", so he could barely see over the wheel of the car. And what Joan did is she rented Angel's brother's Cadillac, which he had down there, which they used for the weddings and stuff. So he became quite famous in town. By the time I saw him again, he was like the biggest star in Alamos, and he had a big following amongst the women. But he had kind of latched on to Joan, and he saw that her life was a fantasy life, and he wanted that life. He didn't want to be moving rocks anymore, so he basically became a kind of extension of Joan. It was funny to see, and it was nice to see too, because they kind of lived a good life together. It's a kind of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, if you will. They were kind of thick as thieves, and she kind of led a good life there until she decided that she wanted to sell the house, and then she came back to Sarasota. One thing is that in Alice's background was one in which her mother shipped her to see her Aunt Alicia, who was supposed to be a successful ballet dancer, but who turned out in Boston when Alice was about 12, and what happened is that when she was there, she soon discovered that her Aunt Alicia, who was a redhead, was not a ballet dancer, but was a stripper, which Alice, who was very rebellious, always loved that deal, because she had all this lingerie around the house. And she must have made a lot of money. She had a big house, big brownstone on the Boston Commons. And it was through Alicia that Alice finally got to meet Hickey Dentista, who was Pinga's mother. This is just about as thick as thieves. Of course, Pinga hadn't been born then, and Kiki's name was Kiki Alvarez, but was also one of the few psychics that Alice really admired. She basically was like an open gateway to the psychic world.